Broadcasting from Silicon Valley, California, this is Conversations with Jennylyn.
You are watching Conversations with Jennylyn, and today, the handsome gentleman sitting across from me is my second interview for my Black Lives Matter series. He came highly recommended, and I cannot wait to share him and his expertise with you. Robert Clark, thank you so much for taking time out of your busy afternoon to share this time with me, and welcome to Conversations with Jennylyn.
Thank you, Jennylyn. It's a pleasure to be with you. My honor. Thank you.
Well, thank you. Now, Robert, could you share a little bit about your background with us?
Sure. I'm just a kid from Youngstown, Ohio, where I was born and raised. Went to school there, played football there, was a Youngstown police officer for 9 years, and eventually went to the FBI in 1995, which took me to Chicago, Washington, D.C. And I always like to pause at the Washington, D.C. part because I arrived in Washington, D.C. on September 9th, 2001, and 9/11 was my second day on the Attorney General's protection detail. So you can imagine how day number 2 went. So I spent 6 years in Washington, D.C. I eventually became a supervisor in the MS-13 National Gang Task Force, which took me to Central America. So I had an opportunity to serve and work in Central America, where I worked with some phenomenal people, both in the FBI and within the police agencies in Central America. And then I eventually promoted and transferred to the Los Angeles division of the FBI, where I was a gang supervisor and eventually became the assistant special agent in charge, where I had program responsibility for gangs, violent crime, organized crime, crimes against children, and drug cartels.
Wow. So as we would say, you hit the ground running. Your second day in 9/11?
Yes, my second day was Tuesday, September 11th, 2001, and it's a day I'll never forget. I know it's a day that will always live in infamy for us, but I got to witness 9/11 right up in the front row of watching things happen in D.C., and then ultimately watching the FBI's response and local and global law enforcement's response to such tragic events.
What was that? Well, clearly it's left an indelible mark on your mind. I wasn't there, and it left an indelible mark on my mind just from what was being reported. What was that like for you? I mean, I'm fascinated. I want to hear some of what you had to experience your first day at work or your second day.
Well, like I said, I was on the Attorney General's protection detail, and I had the honor of serving Mr. John Ashcroft. And I didn't know him. He didn't know me. I was just on the detail. And I remember dropping him off at the airport that morning. Myself and a team of agents dropped him off at the airport that morning. And when we got back to the Department of Justice shortly after 9 o'clock in the morning is when we realized the events were unfolding in New York, and eventually heard and experienced the events unfolding in Washington, D.C. And I can remember when I left the Department of Justice with the vehicle trying to get back to the airport, Reagan National Airport, to pick up the Attorney General. Everyone was fleeing or trying to flee Washington, D.C., which was very difficult at that time. And a lot of people were running and driving to Union Station. And it was like a scene from a movie where everyone is running in one direction, and we were going in the opposite direction to try and get back to the airport. And I remember it was not just a solemn day, but it was a day when you were actually afraid because you just didn't know what was happening. You didn't know what was going to happen next. It was really difficult to keep track of the news reporting. There was reports that there were bombs going off at the State Department, on the Mall of Washington, D.C., which we obviously found out that those were false. But it was very difficult to get information. At this point, the Pentagon had been hit. It was on fire. It was very difficult getting back across the bridge to the airport to pick up the Attorney General. And I recall when he got off the plane, one of the first things that he said to us as his detail and his staff is that the events of today would make the world a place that we would never recognize again from what it was that morning. So it was a very solemn morning, very stoic. And I got to witness and be a part of not only the U.S. government and all of its agencies, but global governments and agencies really going into battle, if you will, trying to understand what was happening and how that was going to not only impact the United States, but how that was going to impact countries around the world. It was a very, very stoic moment for me in my law enforcement career.
You must have been overwhelmed.
It was extremely overwhelming. We worked for days on end until we could set up a process by which we would function as an organization. Certainly, I think it was Director Mueller's third or fourth day on the job as FBI director. So clearly he was overwhelmed with so many things. But I remember conversations where they were literally collapsing criminal and violent crime squads and standing up counterterrorism squads to really get an understanding, both from an operational standpoint and an intellectual standpoint, what had happened on September 11th.
My God. What was it like to work with Mueller?
He was a great leader. I didn't get to know him well because I was on the Attorney General's protection detail. But certainly he was trying to understand the workings of the FBI. He had worked with the FBI certainly throughout his career. Certainly had some oversight when he was at the Department of Justice. But to understand the FBI is another animal in and of itself. So I think he was in the process of not only trying to understand the FBI as an organic organism, if you will, an organization, but to understand what our roles and responsibilities were, what our reaches were, where our personnel were, how we could account for personnel, how we could now start to deploy personnel in both an operational and intelligence collection platform to really understand what the events meant on 9/11, who had perpetrated those events, and how we would get our arms wrapped around that in order to continue protecting America and its citizens, its airspace, its economy, and all the other things that the events of 9/11 eventually impacted.
And boy, did it.
Yeah.
And when that happened, we thought that was the worst thing that happened to America.
Well,
And
certainly at that time it was.
And now we have an invisible organism that's got us all sorts of in the same type of paralysis, and not just America, but the entire world. But we're not going to go there because this interview is not about COVID.
Okay.
So, did you experience any of what we see happening amongst police in the FBI in terms of racial prejudice? And I mean, even though we see all these stories, I'm not there. I'm not privy to the details of them. But as a Black woman who doesn't appear Black, I know what that is like.
Sure.
So I wanted to hear from you if you thought that exists as much as it seems to exist amongst police, men and women in the FBI.
Again, just speaking from my experience and my knowledge, I would share with you that the FBI is an organization made up of individuals and human beings, just like any other organization in the United States. Yes, we have a certain duty and responsibility, and most, if not all of those individuals come to that job just simply wanting to make a difference in the lives of American citizens every day and our interest around the world. But clearly we have to understand that the organization is made up of individuals who bring prejudices with them, biases with them, and a host of other beliefs. We would like to believe that those individuals sort of tear down or let go of some of those prejudices and beliefs. But again, we have to understand that it's an organization made up of people. Yes, I can share that I experienced things in my law enforcement career that certainly can equate to racism and how that impacted me, and things I witnessed, things that were clearly skewed the other direction and not necessarily skewed in my direction as an African-American agent. And the one thing that I would point out is that if you look statistically at the composition of the FBI, even today, in 2020, it's still less than 5% African-American agents. There are 35.
5%?
Yes, less than 5% are African-American agents. And it comes down to several different factors. What does it take to become an FBI agent? What are the standards? What's the process? What's the protocol? What are the recruitment strategies? Who are the individuals that we're talking to? Those things continue to be challenges for the FBI. They have created diversity agent recruitment events because it is such a significant issue. In 2020, there are no African American executives in the FBI at the AD or EAD level. We could probably have a whole nother show on why that exists. But
Yes,
again,
we will.
it's about the creation of opportunity, not just in the FBI, but in other organizations. There are organizations globally that have recognized and witnessed that they just cannot continue to compete globally without a diversified workforce. There have been these instances in law enforcement where we have witnessed and have seen that failure to diversify police departments has really worked to the detriment of that police department and of that community. I'm a firm believer, as a 34-year professional law enforcement, that in order to be effective in addressing not just crime, it's not about just addressing crime, but it's about understanding threats and ultimately understanding communities and people and process and things that are impacting people differently. You have to have a diversified workforce. There are famed police departments across the United States that recognized this phenomena many years ago. And here's where I would demonstrate departments like the New York City Police Department, the Los Angeles Police Department, San Francisco Police Department, and Chicago Police Department, and other major police departments around the United States realized that it did not have a diversified employment body when it came to LGBTQ issues, and they put forward a lot of effort to open doors and create opportunities and create effective recruitment strategies in order to welcome in and encourage and motivate individuals from the LGBTQ community to join police departments, because ultimately they recognized that we needed this sort of diversification on the police department in order to understand, address the needs of that particular community. And that's just one example.
Yes.
We see recruitment strategies, they vary by department across the United States. Some departments are very good at recruiting individuals from their communities so that the police department reflects those faces and cultures and communities and neighborhoods that they are actually called upon to police. And it's not just policing in terms of suppression, but it's policing in terms of service, making sure we're connected to those communities, making sure we understand the plights and the issues within those particular communities. So they are very good at recruiting individuals from those communities. Then there are other recruitment strategies where departments are recruiting individuals from other police departments with lateral transfers. They're recruiting individuals from suburban areas. And then they come into, let's say, the city, and now they have to police individuals that they have very little, and in some instances, no exposure or experience in dealing with and talking with and understanding with, and just understanding the organic nature of some of the neighborhoods that police departments are called upon to police, especially in 2020.
Wow. You know, there's so much that we don't know as civilians. Unless we speak with someone like you, we know of the FBI, and you think all of these institutions are equal opportunity organizations or establishments, and maybe they are, but when you have such a small percentage of African Americans, it really makes you wonder. I think in an ideal world, we should have 10% of every denomination, religion, and racial, and ethnic groups represented.
Yeah, so on the other side of the coin, it would be difficult to do that, Jenny, only because you have to understand that there's such fracture and such disenfranchisement between law enforcement as a profession and a multitude of communities. So it really comes down to what is your strategy, your methodology with connecting to the community in which you are responsible for policing, because ultimately that's where your police officers should come from. And if you have a fractured relationship, a disenfranchised relationship, a non-trusting relationship, it will be very difficult to recruit individuals out of those particular communities. When I think back to when I was a young person and became a police officer in 1986, which was a long time ago, the relationship between law enforcement was different. Now, clearly, we had evolved as a country out of the contested types of relationships in the 50s and 60s and the civil unrest that happened during that time. And there was time for healing. There was time for implementation of different practices and policies. I was actually motivated to be a police officer. It wasn't a job that I just took because I couldn't get any other job. I knew very, very early on in high school that I wanted to be a police officer, but it's because of the relationship that I had with certain police officers in my community, the way they talked to me, the way they treated me. Yes, I got stopped as a young person and so on and so forth. I think that naturally happens. But what I'm trying to say is that my understanding of what it means to be a police officer was highly motivated to want to be a part of that process and making a difference that I wanted to see in my community. Now, did I run into issues when I became a police officer? Yes, the African American community would call me names such as Uncle Tom and other things, sell out, that because I became a police officer. So there was still that fracture. It was just different. And clearly you still have African Americans and people of color and other minorities that are applying to police departments. But again, it's about a recruitment strategy. How are we developing our strategy to recruit individuals from our communities? And we have to do that early on. You can't do that at 18 years old or 21 years old. You have to go back and have process and programs and strategies when young kids are in school, when they're in grade school and they are interacting with police officers on school campuses or in neighborhoods. Way back when we used to have police youth leagues, and some departments have them, some departments don't, but they have police youth leagues where police officers would run basketball camps and football camps and baseball camps and other types of camps for children in the community. And that was a part of really motivating children to want to look at a career in law enforcement. It's very unpopular today. You certainly see hundreds of officers who are retiring and resigning from police departments for a variety of reasons. I know recruitment is down. I know that departments across the country are having a difficult time filling up academy classes, getting a lot of qualified minorities to apply. And again, when we talk about application, like what does the application process entail? Well, it entails not having been in trouble. Most departments, including the FBI, have changed their drug policies, so it's not as long as it used to be. So those policies have changed. You have to have good credit. You have to be a person of good standing and moral character in your community. So one of the standards is you can't be related to criminals and gang members. And again, these become challenges in finding ample amounts of recruits that are motivated to want to join the police department. And this is where chiefs of police and city managers and mayors and city councils, they have to come together, as I'm sure they are now with all of this talk about defunding and disbanding police departments. How are we looking at recruitment now? How do we look at recruitment post George Floyd, where we go back into communities and we build up trust in the communities? Because we've got to treat the law enforcement profession as more than just a job. This cannot be just a job for people to come and get because they couldn't get a job anywhere else. You've got to have a calling to law enforcement, and everyone who comes into law enforcement won't serve the same roles and responsibilities. I was a tactical officer. I was on a tactical team, but that was my path. Other people won't want the tactical aspects of law enforcement. They want to be in the communities running youth police programs and running community policing programs and running community impact programs. They want to be doing these sorts of things. So it's about developing and implementing a strategy which turns into a policy and procedure for how we are recruiting individuals in our departments early on so that they matriculate through a process through high school into college if they choose, or college credits if they choose, to then be able to be qualified to apply to police departments as more than just a job, but a profession and a life calling.
So they really vet people before they hire them.
Yes, there's an extensive vetting process. There's a background process. There's a lie detector process. It's an extreme process that individuals have to go through to become police officers. And that's in most police departments around the United States. I'm sure it varies, here and there. But for the most part, it's a very stringent and strict process. It's a very lengthy process. So it's not just about what you're doing today or what you've done the last 3 months or the last 6 months in your life, but it's ultimately about what you have done your entire life. Now, are there individuals who make mistakes and fall down at some point in their life? Of course there are. And there's a process for that as well, an explanation process for that. And there are some things that police departments will not overlook, but will certainly investigate and vet and make sure that you're an individual that made a mistake 10 years ago. And yes, you've matured and matriculated through that mistake. You've improved your life. These are the things you've done. And it clearly shows the construct and the dynamic of a person, because ultimately, and we're seeing this now, once you hire someone onto your police department, and not just the police department, but any organization, we have to make sure that they don't have credit issues, that they don't have racism issues, that they don't have negative impact social media issues. I'm aware of employers who are having candidates pull up their social media right now at hiring. I'm ready to hire you. Pull up your social media, Facebook, Instagram, whatever, to make sure that they don't have anything that can negatively impact the organization if they hire you. We are seeing college athletes lose scholarships. We're seeing college draft choices lose positions and opportunities to go to professional sports teams, literally because of what they did 2 or 3 years ago on social media. So it all counts now, and it's going to count even more going forward.
So do you think anybody can cheat this test? Like pretend to be someone they're not? Because I know that I was an actress and I can really fool people if I really wanted to. I don't
think that anything is a 100% sure. And to answer your question, yes, I think that people could manipulate their way through a process. Yeah. We would like to think that they wouldn't, but a lot of people can hold their breath long enough to get through a process. But this is where the second and third levels really kind of have to come in and be strong or stronger than the process to get in. And what I mean by that is the academy process. Most departments, if not all departments, are running a very stringent, strict, evaluative, washing people out process in the police academy, FBI academy included. But then after the academy, you have to have a really good, solid field training officer, training agent process where you put this individual with someone who's tried and trusted and true, and look at them in situations. Because again, no matter what scenarios they create for you in the academy, there's nothing like being in either the inner city or the suburbs, daylight, day watch, night watch, afternoon watch, whatever it is, in a real situation. And we will then be able to see how you react under pressure. When Robert and Jennylyn roll up to a corner and there's 15 individuals standing on the street corner and we have to tell them to get off the street corner, I'm going to see how you react. How do you respond? How do you engage? And how do you interact with the people that we're talking to? Do you immediately become physical? Do you immediately become violent? Do you pull your gun? Clearly, these are situations that we have to monitor and mentor young officers through. The situations that have happened around the country, unfortunately, I only know what I see on the media, but just kind of drawing on my own experience. Yes, you have abuse of power. Yes, you have excessive force. Yes, you have some degree of fear that is involved in all of these scenarios. And all of these things come down to what is the department training, how are they mentoring, and ultimately, how are they leading into and through these situations? Mm-hmm. Unfortunately, Jennylyn, what we're dealing with today is not new. If you look back in the history books of the 50s and 60s and 70s, with the Vietnam protest, the protests are not new. My daughter goes to Kent State University, so I clearly know and understand the social protest and social unrest is not new. But we have to look at now, how are we recruiting? How are we training? How are we mentoring? How are we supervising? And ultimately, how are we leading into these situations and through these situations?
How do you feel about this? What's the word I'm trying to think of? Eliminating the police. What are your thoughts on that idea?
Well, clearly we're not going to be able to eliminate the police. And I think, this is a situation where you hear eliminate, defund, dismantle. here's where we have to understand collectively that words have power. And whether it's the media, social media, protesters, whatever the case may be, we have to understand that words have power. When you hear individuals who are using these terms, we really have to step back and understand what is it that they're talking about? What is it that you actually want? Because if you go and talk to most citizens, they absolutely want police, right? So I have worked in the South Los Angeles neighborhoods, East Los Angeles neighborhoods, and have talked to people who absolutely want police. And they have great relationships in this instance with the Los Angeles Police Department. But I think it's about having a conversation about what we've done and what we need to do better or what we need to do differently. So clearly there are some things we need to do better. And now we're in a phase where we are talking about doing some things differently. When you're talking about defunding police departments, that becomes a line item budget sort of situation, and taking monies that are within the police department and allocating it for other things, whatever those other things may be. I think that we're now in the throes of a conversation of what it looks like to shift monies within police departments and city budgets to go towards other types of sociological programs where the police may or may not be involved. I hear conversation about calling social workers to domestic violence calls and other mental health related calls. So clearly there are some conversations that are taking place. When you hear the conversations about dismantling police departments, that's actually a two or threefold conversation. Clearly we cannot do without police.
No.
So there is nowhere on the table where we should be talking about a city or jurisdiction doing without police officers. Because again, at the end of the day, when you call the police, you want someone to come and get the burglar out of your home or stop the robbery in your store, or whatever the case may be. So we clearly want that. And I can tell you, as the son of a murdered father, I want police officers working in the streets and doing what they're supposed to do, and that's serve and protect. So I want them doing that. But I think it warrants having a question: what are the benefits of dismantling a police department? So clearly, if you dismantle a police department, you eliminate on some occasions, if not all occasions, contracts that are strangling the city financially or administratively. So you get rid of that. You potentially get rid of officers that you wouldn't normally be able to get rid of in a normal administrative process. A lot of people don't understand civil service protection for police officers. I have witnessed police officers who have been fired and under civil service protection have gotten their jobs back 2 and 3 times because the Civil Service Commission gave those officers their jobs back. So clearly there are a lot of limitations to the chief, to the mayor, to the city council, to the city manager, to the police commission when you're dealing with those sort of dynamics. But again, whatever conversation we put on the table, short of doing away with the police department, I think we have to talk about how do we build a better system? How do we build a better system of policing, of community engagement? Now, you can look back in my career and I can tell you, I'm a tremendous advocate for building bridges before you need them, right? So I'm all about having the conversations with people that I wouldn't normally have conversations with. Certainly social groups, nonprofit groups, community activist groups, gang leaders. One of the things that we certainly recognize, in Los Angeles is that gangs aren't going anywhere. They're going to be here. So we had to develop a much more effective way of dealing with them. And certainly the Los Angeles Police Department has been the tip of the spear when it comes to that. And other police departments around the United States have followed suit and sitting down and having conversations, because you're not going to get rid of gangs. It's really endemic to our culture and for a variety of reasons, which is a whole nother show. But we have to understand that they're a legitimate, illegitimate part of our society. So we have to deal with them. Because when I was a young police officer, a person that was a mentor to me shared 3 things with me that stuck with me my whole career. Robert, you're not going to be able to arrest everybody. You can't beat up everybody, and you can't take everybody to jail. So you better learn how to talk to people. So it's about having a conversation. We don't necessarily have to leave the table agreeing on everything, but at least understanding, can we be partners in this effort? You want to see your children be able to be safe in neighborhoods, and your parents and your grandparents be safe in neighborhoods. And there have been some successes over the years with those kind of collaborations and partnerships and things that have taken place on that level. But I think we have to be committed to a transparent, and I'm going to stress this again, a transparent and integral, a fair and equal application of justice in policing and law enforcement. In other words, you cannot be hidden. People need to understand what you're doing. They can't be cloudy about what the process is. Why is this happening over here and not happening over there?
Right.
And we're having no conversation literally until everything is on fire and we're standing at the intersection of walk and don't walk. That is what you don't want to have happen. You want to have those conversations long before you need them, so that when you have issues, and unfortunately, as I said earlier, law enforcement organizations are organizations made up of people, and people make mistakes.
Right.
We are going to have police officers who make mistakes. They are going to do things wrong. God forbid they are going to do things illegal. And when we have those occurrences, we have to have a proven and trusted process of transparency, of integrity, of fair and equal justice process, in making sure that we are holding ourselves accountable to doing just what protecting and serving means. It means to serve and protect all equally. Now, does that happen every single day? Probably not. But we have to have a transparent and integral process that helps us come back towards the middle as close as we can get.
And you mentioned during this conversation that you're the son of a murdered father. Was he murdered before you became a police officer?
Yes, my father was murdered January 15th, 1980 in Youngstown, Ohio. Unfortunately, my father was not on the right side of the law, was a criminal. Actually operated a nightclub for the Italian organized crime in Youngstown, Ohio, and was in the middle of a drug deal and some other argument that did not go his way, and he was shot and killed. And I remember him leaving the house. I remember when the police officers came back to the house about an hour later and told me that my father had been shot and killed. And I remember, because I use this constantly with the kids that I mentor in my program, is that when I shut that door on my childhood, and now it was time for me to grow up, because I had a younger sister. I had a mother who struggled for years with my father's death, and it just completely changed the way I was going to grow up as a young African American.
I'm very proud of you.
Well, I thank you for saying that. It has certainly been a challenging journey. I don't ever represent that it was ever easy for me. I struggled through school. I struggled in so many aspects of growing up. That's why I can relate so well to so many of the issues that are happening in our society right now today. I mean, for example, I grew up in foster care from age 4 till I was 12 years old. I grew up in public housing. I grew up in the hood, if you will. Yes, I was influenced by what were beginning to be what we now call gangs. So I had all of those influences, but I did have some people in my life who pushed and steered and at times drugged me in the right direction. But again, I always had a sense of right and wrong and wanting to do right. And I think, like I said, when I closed the door that day on January 15th, 1980, I closed the doorway to my life. And God had a bigger purpose for my life, a bigger purpose for my pain is what I always call it. I didn't know it then, but certainly I got to evolve in that, and not just in my law enforcement career, but my nonprofit work, working with nonprofit organizations, running my own mentoring program, working with inner city youth, listening to their stories and understanding. That's why when we go back and we try and explain or talk about what's happening now, starting with Minneapolis and far beyond that and far before that, I understand the frustration. I understand the pain. Martin Luther King says riots are the language of the unheard. Mm-hmm. I understand what it feels like to be unheard. It doesn't justify it, right? I don't justify looting and murdering and burning down and all those other things that are happening, but I understand the frustration when you constantly are unheard. You constantly can't see transparency. You constantly are not dealing with integrity. You are constantly dealing with the unfair application of justice. It becomes frustrated and no one's listening to you, or you feel like no one's listening to you. You don't have a process to engage this big system. A lot of people don't understand that our system of justice is very, very big. And when you don't have a voice to engage that effectively or financially, you become frustrated. You feel like you're not heard, and then you only lash out at the things you can lash out at, and it becomes very frustrating. So I understand the frustration. That's why I'm hopeful that the departments and cities and mayors and city councils and city managers and politicians and everyone else understand that this is our moment. There is a movement afoot, but this is our moment to do something different, to construct something different. If we don't lead differently, if we don't do something differently, we will only be back here 10 or 15 years from now having the very same conversations, and they can put 2025 on the next Time magazine, which they put 2000 or 1996 or 98 and 2005, and we can just keep stacking the years, because if we do nothing different, nothing will be different. And Albert Einstein says the definition of insanity is to do the same thing over and over again and expect different results.
I was going to say that. I was waiting on you to stop. We are out of time. Can you believe it? But you can't go yet.
Okay.
Before I wrap this up, and you have implied more than once that you'd be willing to do another segment with me. You're like a fountain of experience and knowledge, and I can't just like let this opportunity pass me by. So I will be reaching out to you for segment 2.
Okay.
But before you go, in segment 1, as someone who worked in the FBI, what, from your experience, do you think is necessary for revamping the system, for making it more fair? I mean, you explained up front why the numbers are what they are in terms of, the African American representation. But what would you think would create a more effective policing system in our country?
Well, that's a multi-layered question.
I know. I ask you 100 questions in one capsule.
Yes, that is absolutely
the way you feel comfortable.
Yeah. So I think right now we are in a stage where we have to recognize that we have to have a difference-making conversation. That's where we are now. So I'll give you an example. You've heard a lot of departments and jurisdictions that have taken the chokehold away from officers. They've outlawed the chokehold. I'm very familiar with what is called the carotid hold. It was a technique that was taught many, many years ago to me as a police officer. I've never used it, but I understand the technique. And we have to understand that police officers are trained on what is called the use of force continuum. And that use of force continuum begins with their physical presence. I show up in a uniform. That is the beginning of use of force, because now I'm going to start telling people what to do. That's verbal commands. And eventually it can all obviously escalate up through putting hands on people, arresting people, using a nightstick, using a taser if that's necessary, all the way up to using your firearm if that's warranted and necessary. And there are policies that drive all of these things. My concern is taking that out of the use of force continuum. What are you replacing it with? So that would be my question. What are you replacing it with? Because now you've created a gap between the time I can use, say, my taser and the time I can move to use my firearm, because we have to make sure that we are keeping police officers safe. We are the peacekeepers, so we have to be kept safe in keeping that peace. Now is where we need to be having conversations about what we're going to do differently. What can we do? What contractually can we do? Can we not do? And I imagine that this is where a variety of cities and police departments are right now, and trying to decide contractually what can we do and what can we not do. That's probably one of the reasons that Minneapolis is moving to disband their police department, because it then gives them an opportunity to do away with the contract, do away with officers that they may not necessarily want. They'll rehire officers that they do want, create a new police department. It'll be a new contract conversation, and now we begin anew. But it's important to understand, what do we want to do differently, and how are we going to do it differently? So from my seat and my perspective as a retired agent of the FBI, certainly a police officer for 9 years, and in law enforcement, both domestically and internationally for the last 34 years, I would say that I hope that they're taking inventory of what it is that that facilitates and operates our police department, and how can we do things differently. But however we're going to do things differently operationally, we've got to do things differently communicatively. We've got to be talking to our elements within the community and understanding the demands, the concerns, the wants, the needs, the lack of transparency, the lack of integrity, or the perceptions thereof, in having conversations. Now, is it a situation where everyone is going to get 100% of what they want? Absolutely not. But we've got to move the needle from where it is now toward a more fair and equitable position, so that at least we can begin creating dialogue and process. And then as we, as we move through that, we'll then be able to understand how we engage at various levels. Does the FBI engage more in color of law cases and civil rights cases? Do they engage more in police corruption? I can tell you that those programs within the FBI, I never worked them, but I know there are robust conversations going on right now about how they can engage more robustly, even more than they were already. So those things exist, they stand, they've done a great job in a variety of cities across the United States, but I can guarantee you they're having a conversation about how we can do that more robustly, more timely, more transparently, so that we become part of the conversation and we become part of the problem solving in our communities.
Before I let you go, last question. Did you ever feel threatened or that your life was in danger? And if you had that experience, how did you handle it?
Yes, I have had that experience when I was a young police officer and I was working undercover. Yes, I had that experience where individuals realized that I was an undercover police officer when they all came to court, because when they all got arrested, they didn't know that I was a police officer. When they came to court, they realized that I was, and they wanted to, put out a contract and have things done to me. My name was spray painted on police cars, kill Clark, that sort of thing. And again, my police department responded to those threats, and we dealt with them accordingly within the system. As an FBI agent, I didn't have that as a case. As an international consultant, an international police officer working in Trinidad and Tobago, I've had those sorts of issues where individuals were not happy that I, as a former FBI executive, was on the ground in Trinidad trying to solve homicides and gang issues and all the other things. And again, those things were dealt with, sufficiently to be able to afford me as much safety as possible. But this stands for every police officer, every woman and every man that puts on that uniform and hangs that badge on their chest. They depend on the system to help and support and protect them. They depend on that. We swear to that. Yes, every police officer is almost willing to put our life on the line for what we believe in, and that's truth and justice and fairness and service and all those other things. But we want to make sure that this system, this organization, this city that we serve stands behind us as well. So again, we are in that phase where we're going to be having conversations, and they're going to be having conversations about how we do a better and more integral, more transparent job of doing that. And I encourage and applaud the courage that it's going to take to have those conversations. There are going to be some unpopular conversations to have, but we are in a time, in a moment, in a movement where we have to have those conversations, or just sit back and wait for this to happen again.
They're absolutely necessary. There's so much havoc taking place now because people are unhappy. And I can't wait to put this interview up, because there's so much we don't know as a civilian. We only have ideas, and most of our opinions are based on what's reported on mainstream media. So it's nice to hear from someone like yourself. It's funny, I've just started this series, and both of my interviewees have been retired police officers. So I'm very thrilled, and I'm grateful to you. And there's still so many questions, but I know after 30 minutes, people tune out on these interviews. So we have to do another one at your convenience.
Sure. You just let me know, and we'll make the time.
Okay, Robert, thank you so much.
You're welcome.
You are a very successful human, and I see you as a successful person who's made a difference in the world, and not as a color. I never see people as a color. And I'm very proud and happy that you have given so much to the world, even though you had a rough beginning. It's people like you that we want to hear from, so that people who feel hopeless know there is hope, and it's all about your attitude.
The last thing that I'll share with you, and I don't know if Nigel told you this, probably the most humbling moment of my life is when I retired from the FBI and had the opportunity to go to television and act for CBS and do a true life crime series for A&E. This is a kid who came from inner city, from public housing, from foster care, from a murdered father, and I got to go reinvestigate the JonBenet Ramsey case. So to be on television, to have that opportunity, and I use that as a beacon of hope, is that if it could happen to me, it can happen for you. And I choose to use my pain and things that have happened to me to help other people progress, to help other people heal, to help other people succeed. Because yes, if I did it, it is possible for you too. So thank you.
Nigel did send that to me, and unfortunately I wasn't well, and I need to go back and watch it.
That's
But
okay.
people, did you hear what he just said? Can you repeat that, and can you tell them where they could find it?
Yes. So I had an opportunity to
CBS.
Yeah, so I had an opportunity to act with CBS on a series called Hunted, and it actually aired for 8 weeks. It only got season 1, but television is a business. I had the opportunity to become a true crime investigator for A&E, and I got a chance to reinvestigate the JonBenet Ramsey case, which is an American famous case. So those things were very humbling for me, because I know where I came from. I came from the inner city. I came from public housing. I came from not doing well in school. I came from getting in trouble. I came from, the son of a murdered father. So I had many challenges, and I was able to navigate and have help. That's the important thing to note, is that I had help in navigating those things. I didn't navigate those things by myself. In other words, I had people who put boots on my feet so that I could eventually pull myself up by those bootstraps. So it was not just me. It was people helping me, blessing me, encouraging me, and just helping me along the way. But it's possible because I was able to do it too. So.
And you showed them that you were worth their time and their investment.
Yes.
Clearly.
Yes, I was worth their time and investment, and I'm close and friends with them to this very day. And I owe them my very existence. And I just hope that I continue to make them proud. And I don't know what God has for me next. I would love to be chief of police somewhere, but I don't know what God has for me next. And I just wait and wait for him to open those doors.
Keep trusting him. He doesn't disappoint. I'm here to assure you of that.
I appreciate that. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I hope you have enjoyed this.
Yeah, it was good. Thank you.
I have. And thank you so much for watching Conversations with Jennylyn. When a conversation is all you need to be inspired. And if you're not inspired by this segment, you were asleep, and I know you weren't. And I will see you next time.